Picture an archaeological dig site somewhere in Eastern Europe. The year is 1973, the ground is dry, and a team of researchers has been carefully excavating what appears to be a burial site from the Chalcolithic period, the Copper Age, roughly 5 to 6,000 years ago. They've found several individuals already, average sized, consistent with what they expected. Nothing to rewrite any textbooks over. Then they find another skeleton. The lead researcher measures the femur, then measures it again, then calls over a colleague who measures it a third time. The numbers keep coming back the same, and what those numbers suggest when extrapolated to full living height using standard forensic formulas is a person who stood somewhere around 6 feet 7 inches tall. In the Copper Age, thousands of years before protein shakes, before modern agriculture was fully developed, before everything that modern people assume is responsible for human height. The researcher looks at the skeleton for a long moment. The skeleton, as skeletons do, says nothing useful. This is where the story of ancient human height begins. Not with a simple answer, but with the realization that the question is considerably more complicated, more surprising, and more revealing about human biology and history than the question itself suggests. Because the moment you start seriously digging into how tall ancient humans actually grew, you discover that the comfortable narrative that modern humans are taller than ancient humans because we eat better and live better is true in the aggregate, massively oversimplified in the specifics, and actively wrong in ways that are worth understanding. Ancient humans were not uniformly short. They were not a species of compact, stocky people waiting for modernity to give them height. The height history of Homo sapiens is a story of dramatic variation across populations, across time periods, and across environmental conditions. A story with peaks and valleys that sometimes directly contradict what common sense would predict. And the question of how tall an ancient human could actually grow is one that touches fundamental biology, nutrition science, evolutionary theory, and the complex history of human societies in ways that end up being far more interesting than the simple comparison chart that usually gets posted online. Start with the biological ceiling, because any discussion of ancient height needs to establish what human biology was actually capable of producing before asking what ancient environments allowed. Human height is a polygenic trait controlled by thousands of genetic variants distributed across the genome, each contributing a small effect that adds up to the final outcome. Current genomic research has identified over 700 genetic loci associated with height variation in modern humans, and this number increases as studies become more powerful and comprehensive. The combined effect of these loci explains roughly 60 to 80% of height variation between individuals, with the remainder attributable to environmental factors, primarily nutrition, disease burden, and psychosocial stress during the growth years. The genetic architecture of height is ancient. The variants that influence height today were present in human populations tens of thousands of years ago. The biological machinery for producing tall individuals, the growth hormone axis, the growth plates, the skeletal architecture, was fully established long before the Neolithic Revolution, long before agriculture, long before any of the historical developments that people associate with improved human physical development. This means the biological ceiling for ancient human height was not meaningfully different from the biological ceiling for modern human height. The genetic potential for a very tall human existed in the Paleolithic. What varied, dramatically and revealingly, was how fully that potential was expressed in different populations under different conditions. The growth hormone axis is the core biological system at stake. Growth hormone, produced by the anterior pituitary gland, stimulates the liver to produce insulin-like growth factor 1, IGF-1, which drives longitudinal bone growth at the growth plates, the cartilaginous zones near the ends of long bones, where new bone tissue is added during childhood and adolescence. The growth plates remain open and responsive to IGF-1 signals until they fuse, typically in the late teens to early 20s, at which point height is fixed. The entire window of height determination is childhood and adolescence. What this means practically is that everything that affects the growth hormone axis during that developmental window affects final adult height. Adequate protein intake drives IGF-1 production. Zinc, vitamin D, and other micronutrients are essential for growth plate function. Sleep quality matters because growth hormone is primarily secreted during deep sleep. Chronic infection and disease divert metabolic resources from growth to immune function. Psychosocial stress elevates cortisol, which actively suppresses growth hormone secretion. All of these factors were highly variable in ancient human populations, and their variation explains more of the ancient height story than genetics does. Now, look at what the skeletal record actually shows, because this is where expectations get seriously disrupted. Upper Paleolithic humans, the anatomically modern humans who inhabited Europe and parts of Western Asia during the period roughly 15 to 35,000 years ago, were tall, strikingly tall by historical comparison. Analysis of skeletal remains from this period consistently yields average heights that would be competitive in modern Western populations. Male remains from Upper Paleolithic sites in Europe show average heights clustering around 5 feet 10 inches to 6 feet, comparable to average heights in contemporary Northern European countries today. These were hunter-gatherers. They had no agriculture, no dairy farming at scale, no grain surpluses, no food storage systems more sophisticated than what nature and immediate preservation techniques provided. They were entirely dependent on wild food availability, which fluctuated seasonally. By the standard narrative, better nutrition equals greater height, and ancient people had worse nutrition, they should have been short. They were not short. The explanation lies in diet quality rather than diet quantity or reliability. Paleolithic hunter-gatherers who were consuming large game animals were getting extraordinary access to complete proteins, all essential amino acids in the proportions that human physiology uses most efficiently. They were consuming organ meats rich in fat-soluble vitamins and micronutrients. They were consuming bone marrow, collagen-rich connective tissues, and other animal products that modern diets rarely approach in nutritional density. Their plant food consumption was diverse and wild, providing a broad micronutrient spectrum. They were also, relative to later agricultural populations, experiencing lower chronic disease burdens. Hunter-gatherer groups below a certain population density do not sustain the epidemic infectious diseases that require dense, settled populations to maintain. Measles, smallpox, typhoid. The crowd diseases that devastated historical populations were not circulating through a band of 30 nomadic hunter-gatherers the way they circulated through a settled agricultural village of 300. Lower infectious disease burden meant less immune system competition for metabolic resources that would otherwise go to growth. The result was tall people, people whose genetic potential for height was being expressed under conditions that, while uncertain and sometimes brutal, were nutritionally rich and pathogenically less burdensome than what came after. What came after was the Neolithic Revolution, the development of agriculture, and it produced one of the most dramatic reductions in average human height in the entire fossil record. This is the part that should genuinely startle anyone who hasn't encountered it, because it inverts the entire intuitive story about human progress and physical development. When human populations transitioned from hunter-gathering to agriculture, average heights fell, measurably, significantly, across multiple populations on multiple continents where this transition has been studied. The reduction in average height associated with early agricultural adoption is documented in skeletal collections from the Middle East, from Europe, from Asia, from the Americas. It is one of the most robust and consistent findings in bioarchaeology. In some populations, the height reduction was substantial, 3 to 4 inches of average height lost across a transition from pre-agricultural to early agricultural populations, 3 to 4 inches, in the wrong direction from what progress would predict. The reasons are not mysterious once you understand the nutritional and epidemiological consequences of early agriculture. The Neolithic diet, dominated by cereal grains, was dramatically lower in protein density and micronutrient diversity than the Paleolithic diet it replaced. Wheat and barley and millet provide calories efficiently. That was the agricultural bargain. More calories per unit of land. But they provide incomplete proteins, lower zinc and iron bioavailability, and a micronutrient spectrum that is narrower than what diverse wild foods offered. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Early agricultural populations were also experiencing dramatically higher infectious disease burdens. Settled populations, living in permanent villages near their own waste, maintaining domestic animals in close proximity, trading with other settled populations, these are ideal conditions for pathogen spread. The crowd diseases found the dense, settled agricultural populations and established endemic cycles that hunter-gatherer bands had largely escaped. Children in early agricultural villages were fighting off infections constantly, diverting protein and energy away from growth and into immune response. And then there was the social stratification that agriculture enabled. Hunter-gatherer societies are generally characterized by relatively flat social hierarchies with limited ability to accumulate resources across generations. Agriculture created food surpluses that could be stored, controlled, and distributed unequally. Early agricultural societies developed social stratification that concentrated nutritional resources in elite groups and restricted them from lower status groups. The average height in an early agricultural population reflects not just the average nutrition available, but the distribution of that nutrition across the social hierarchy. And the distribution was increasingly unequal. The height reduction of the Neolithic is arguably the most compelling single piece of evidence against naive linear narratives of human progress. The people who invented civilization, the settled agricultural societies that developed writing and metallurgy and monumental architecture, were shorter, less healthy, and by multiple skeletal markers under greater physiological stress than the nomadic people whose lifestyle they replaced. They did trade real costs in health and height for real benefits in population density, cultural complexity, and long-term civilizational capacity. But the trade was exactly that. A trade, with genuine costs, not a straightforward improvement in human biological condition. Now the height story gets more geographically complex because different ancient populations showed dramatically different height patterns that can't be explained by simple agricultural versus non-agricultural comparisons. The pastoralist populations of the Eurasian steppe, the people who domesticated horses and cattle and spread westward into Europe during the Bronze Age, were tall. Archaeological skeletal studies of Yamnaya and related steppe pastoralist populations from roughly 3 to 5,000 years ago show males averaging around 5 feet 10 inches, with significant numbers reaching 6 feet or above. These were not hunter-gatherers in the classic sense, but neither were they grain-dependent agriculturalists. They were dairy-dependent pastoralists with high animal protein and fat intake, mobile lifestyles that reduced settled population disease burden, and genetic profiles that included variants selected for in high-protein, dairy-rich dietary environments. When these steppe populations expanded into Europe, mixing with the shorter-statured farming populations already living there, the genetic and dietary contribution they brought shifted the European average upward. The height genetics of modern Northern Europeans reflect this mixing, a contribution from steppe ancestry that included both height-associated genetic variants and the cultural practice of dairy consumption that drove positive selection for lactase persistence, enabling adults to digest milk and thereby access an additional high-quality protein and fat source. The medieval period in Europe provides another set of surprising data points. Early medieval European populations, from roughly 500 to 900 CE, show average heights comparable to modern European. Averages around 5 feet 7 to 5 feet 8 inches for males. This is higher than many people expect for a period commonly imagined as uniformly harsh and malnourished. The early medieval diet in many parts of Europe, while not as protein-rich as upper Paleolithic diets, included substantial animal products, wild game access, and a broader dietary base than the grain-dominated late medieval diet that replaced it. Late medieval and early modern Europeans, by contrast, were shorter on average than their early medieval predecessors. The population growth and agricultural intensification of the high medieval period pushed more people into grain-dependent diets with lower animal protein access. The late medieval famines and the catastrophic population pressure on agricultural land created conditions where the nutritional floor dropped. Skeletal evidence from this period shows shorter average statures and higher rates of developmental stress markers, Harris lines in bone indicating periods of growth interruption, enamel hypoplasia in teeth indicating nutritional or infectious stress during childhood. What this pattern reveals is that ancient human height was not on a simple upward trajectory toward modern heights. It oscillated, sometimes dramatically, in response to changes in diet, disease burden, social structure, and climate. The ancient human who could grow tallest was not necessarily the most technologically advanced or the most civilized. They were the one growing up in conditions that allowed their genetic potential to express most fully. The absolute upper limit of individual height in ancient populations brings us back to the skeleton in the Copper Age burial and the broader question of outliers. What was the tallest an ancient human could actually grow? The growth hormone axis, when functioning normally, produces height within a genetically determined range. When it malfunctions in a specific direction, when the pituitary gland produces excess growth hormone, usually due to a benign tumor called a pituitary adenoma, the result is gigantism in children with open growth plates, producing individuals of extraordinary stature. Acromegaly is the adult equivalent, where excess growth hormone after growth plate fusion produces overgrowth of soft tissues and specific bones rather than overall height increase. Skeletal evidence of pituitary gigantism in ancient populations exists. Unusually tall ancient individuals, when examined carefully, sometimes show the distinctive skeletal features associated with pituitary excess. Enlarged hands and feet bones, distinctive skull changes, jaw overgrowth. The giant of Castelnau, skeletal material found in France in the 19th century and attributed to Neolithic period, showed bone dimensions suggesting extraordinary stature. Various Bronze Age skeletal assemblages across Europe and the Middle East include individuals whose reconstructed heights suggest genuine pathological gigantism. Without pathology, the tallest ancient individuals were probably comparable to the tallest normal individuals today, the genetic outliers who draw the tall end of the normal distribution. A population with genetic height potential similar to modern populations, expressing that potential under favorable nutritional conditions, would produce individuals reaching 6 feet 4, 6 feet 5, 6 feet 6, or beyond as natural outliers in a large enough population. The historical and legendary accounts of giants across cultures, the biblical Goliath, the giants of Greek mythology, the legendary tall warriors of various oral traditions, likely reflect real encounters with individuals of exceptional stature, exaggerated by cultural transmission, but grounded in the genuine existence of tall outliers in ancient populations. A warrior 6 feet 5 inches tall in a population averaging 5 feet 7 would be an extraordinary physical presence. The cultural processing of that presence across generations could produce the mythological giant. The biblical description of Goliath provides an interesting specific case. The most commonly cited height, 6 cubits and a span, translates to roughly 9 feet 6 inches in the standard translation, which would be biologically impossible. But textual scholarship has identified manuscript variations suggesting the original text may have described Goliath as considerably shorter, perhaps 4 cubits and a span, which translates to roughly 6 feet 9 inches. A person of 6 feet 9 inches in the ancient Near East would have been legitimately extraordinary and would have created exactly the kind of cultural impression that generates legendary accounts. The number may have been inflated in transmission, but the core observation, an unusually tall warrior who stood out dramatically from the norm, likely reflects reality. The question of what the human skeleton can actually support at extreme heights adds another dimension to the "how tall could an ancient human grow" question, because height is not simply an achievement, it's an engineering challenge for the skeletal and cardiovascular systems. The human skeleton is designed around a specific range of height, and at extreme statures, the design faces real challenges. The spine bears compressive loads that scale with height and body mass, and very tall individuals have higher rates of spinal problems, including vertebral compression and disc degeneration. The cardiovascular system must pump blood against a greater gravitational head pressure, requiring a proportionally larger and more powerful heart at extreme heights. The long bones of the legs bear bending forces that scale with height in ways that create structural stress at extreme statures. Robert Wadlow, the tallest person in modern recorded history at 8 feet 11 inches, required leg braces to walk and showed progressive neurological involvement from the spinal effects of his condition by the time of his death at 22. His height was the product of pituitary gigantism, continuous, uncontrolled growth hormone excess, rather than normal variation. The structural challenges his body faced were not incidental to his height. They were direct consequences of a skeleton and cardiovascular system operating at the extreme outer edge of what human biology can sustain. For an ancient person without modern medical support, surviving to adulthood with pathological gigantism would have been challenging, though not impossible. The archaeological examples of very tall ancient individuals are, in most cases, adults who did survive to adulthood despite their stature, suggesting that at least some individuals with pituitary-driven excess height were able to function, though their long-term outcomes without modern intervention would likely have involved progressive complications. Normal variation, by contrast, produces tall individuals without the progressive physiological complications of pathological excess. A person whose genetic potential combined with excellent nutrition produces a height of 6 feet 4 or 6 feet 6 is operating well within the structural capacity of human skeletal design, with no special engineering vulnerabilities attached to their stature. What then is the honest answer to how tall an ancient human could actually grow? Under favorable nutritional conditions, high protein intake, adequate micronutrients, low disease burden, expressing maximum normal genetic potential, ancient humans could reach heights entirely comparable to the tallest normal individuals in any modern population. 6 feet 4, 6 feet 5, possibly taller, in individuals with particularly favorable genetic combinations. In populations like the Upper Paleolithic Europeans or the steppe pastoralists, where dietary conditions allowed strong genetic expression, the tall end of the population likely included individuals who would attract no particular notice walking through a modern northern European city. With pathological gigantism, pituitary adenoma producing excess growth hormone during the growth years, ancient individuals could have reached the extraordinary heights documented in very tall modern individuals with the same condition, though their survival and functional capacity beyond early adulthood would have been limited without medical intervention. The comfortable assumption that ancient humans were uniformly short, that tallness is a modern achievement, that our ancestors were compact and small by necessity, this assumption is simply not supported by the skeletal evidence. Ancient humans were as variable in height as modern humans, more variable in some respects because their nutritional environments were more extreme in both directions. The most nutritionally privileged ancient humans, the elite of high-protein dietary cultures, the genetic outliers drawing the tall end of the distribution, in any large population, were as tall as anyone alive today, or nearly so. The skeleton in the Copper Age burial that opened this story is not an anomaly. It is a data point in a highly variable distribution, reflecting a human biology that has always been capable of producing tall individuals when conditions allowed. The surprise is not that ancient humans could be tall. The surprise is that we ever assumed they couldn't.